The story begins the moment you realize that some connections feel different, not louder or more dramatic, but strangely familiar, like you've known this energy before without ever meeting it. From the very beginning, there is a quiet recognition on their side, even if they never say it out loud. You arrive in their life not as chaos, not as a chase, but as something steady, warm, and grounding. And for someone who has spent most of their life emotionally bracing for impact, that kind of presence feels rare. They may not use the word lucky, but they feel it in their body. A subtle relief, a sense that for once, life didn't hand them something sharp, it handed them you. And for a while, that feeling stayed. It lingers in the way they look at you when you're not watching, in the way they soften without realizing it, in the way their guard lowers just enough for them to feel what they've been missing all along. You don't arrive trying to fix them or change them, you simply exist as you are, calm, attentive, emotionally aware. And that alone is disarming. Avoidants are used to intensity that burns fast or distance that feels safe. They know how to manage those extremes. What they don't know how to manage is someone who offers closeness without demand, affection without control, presence without pressure. That's where the confusion starts. Because being with you doesn't feel like danger, but it also doesn't feel familiar. And for an avoidant nervous system, unfamiliar often registers as unsafe, even when it's gentle. Still, in those early moments, they let themselves feel it. They let themselves believe, if only briefly, that maybe this time is different. Maybe they finally got lucky. There's a quiet awe they feel toward you, even if they never admit it. They notice how you listen instead of waiting to speak, how you sense shifts in energy before words are spoken, how you offer reassurance without being asked. These are not small things to someone who has spent a lifetime relying on self-protection. You don't push past their boundaries, but you don't disappear either, and that balance is rare. It makes them feel chosen without being trapped, seen without being exposed. For a while, this feels like the best version of connection they've ever known. And somewhere deep inside, they understand the truth they're afraid to say out loud. People like you don't come into their life often. As the connection deepens, something subtle begins to shift. Not in you, but in them. The safety you provide starts to touch places they've kept locked away for years. Old emotions, unprocessed memories, long buried needs. And that's when the lux starts to feel complicated. Because with you, they can't hide behind emotional distance the same way. Your consistency doesn't demand vulnerability, but it invites it. And invitations can feel like threats to someone whose survival once depended on staying emotionally closed. They begin to feel exposed, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because closeness removes the armor they've relied on for so long. The very thing that makes you feel safe to others makes them feel emotionally naked. They may start to pull back in small ways at first, a little less eye contact, a little more silence, a delay in responses that didn't exist before, not because their feelings disappeared, but because they intensified. The irony is painful. The more they feel connected to you, the more their nervous system panics. Love to them has always come with a cost. And even though you haven't asked for anything unreasonable, their body remembers a time when closeness meant loss, rejection, or being overwhelmed. So their instincts take over. Distance becomes regulation. Withdrawal becomes relief. And yet, even as they step back, the feeling of luck doesn't disappear. It turns into something heavier, something bittersweet. They still feel fortunate to have met you. They still recognize your value. In fact, they may recognize it more clearly now than ever. But recognition doesn't equal readiness. And this is where the internal conflict begins. Part of them wants to stay in the warmth you offer, to lean into the ease of being understood without explanation. Another part of them is screaming to regain control, to return to the emotional independence that once kept them safe. They don't know how to reconcile these two parts. So instead of choosing one consciously, they oscillate. Closer, farther, warm, cold. And you're left feeling the shift without understanding why. You might sense that something is changing before they ever say it, the way conversations lose depth, the way affection becomes inconsistent, the way they seem present one moment and unreachable the next. This is not because you stopped being enough. It's because being with you requires them to confront parts of themselves they've avoided for years. Your presence highlights the gap between who they are emotionally and who they would need to be to stay. And that gap feels overwhelming. Staying with you would mean growth, vulnerability, and emotional risk. Leaving, on the other hand, feels familiar, painful, yes, but familiar pain is often more tolerable than unfamiliar healing. They may tell themselves stories to justify the distance, that the timing isn't right, that they're not in the right headspace, that something feels off. But what feels off is not you, it's intimacy. It's the quiet expectation of emotional consistency. It's the mirror you hold up simply by being yourself. You don't accuse them. You don't chase them. You don't demand explanations. And that too makes this harder because there's no villain in the story. There's just someone who feels lucky to have found you and terrified of what that means. Even as they pull away, a part of them holds on to the truth. They know you are rare. They know what you offered was genuine. They know that the way you showed up was not something they can easily replace. And that knowledge lingers. It follows them into the silence they created. It sits with them when they choose distance over depth. They may not say it, but they feel it. Losing you is not neutral. It registers as a loss, even if they were the one who created the space. And yet, the fear of staying outweighs the pain of leaving. So they choose the path that feels safer to their nervous system, even if it hurts more in the long run. You, on the other hand, are left standing in the aftermath, trying to understand how something that felt so real could end without a clear reason. You replay moments, conversations, energy shifts. You wonder if you gave too much, cared too deeply, or arrived too fully. But the truth is simpler and harder to accept. You didn't lose them because you lacked value. You didn't overwhelm them by being too much. You overwhelmed their defenses by being real. And for someone who has survived by avoiding emotional depth, that can feel unbearable. They felt lucky to have you. That part is real, but luck alone cannot override unhealed patterns. It cannot calm a nervous system wired for distance. It cannot replace the work required to stay. And so the connection ends not with clarity, but with quiet confusion. Not because love wasn't present, but because love arrived before they were ready to receive it. And as painful as that is, it does not diminish what you brought into their life. If anything, it confirms it. Because people do not feel lucky about what is ordinary. They feel lucky about what is rare. As the connection continues, the tension inside them grows louder, even if they stay quiet on the outside. This is the stage where their body knows something their mind hasn't fully admitted yet. Your presence is no longer just comforting. It's activating. You don't provoke them with chaos or drama, but with consistency. And consistency is unsettling for someone who learned early that closeness never lasts. Their nervous system starts scanning for danger. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because things feel too steady, too calm, too real. The absence of emotional turbulence feels suspicious, as if peace itself must be temporary. And when peace feels temporary, the instinct is to leave before it disappears on its own. They start to feel things they haven't felt in a long time: longing, tenderness, hope. These emotions sound beautiful, but to someone avoidant, they are heavy. They come with vulnerability attached. Vulnerability means dependence, and dependence feels like a loss of control. So instead of leaning in, they brace. They might become more reserved, more analytical, more distant, not because their feelings faded, but because they intensified beyond what they know how to regulate. You become a reminder of what they want and what they fear at the same time, and that contradiction exhausts them internally. They may begin to admire you even more during this phase. They see how you remain emotionally open without becoming desperate, how you communicate without manipulation, how you offer understanding without erasing yourself. This quiet strength doesn't go unnoticed. In fact, it amplifies the feeling of luck. They recognize that what you bring is rare, not just emotionally, but energetically. You don't force closeness, yet closeness happens naturally around you. You don't demand trust, yet trust starts to form. And that's the problem. Trust removes their escape routes. It makes leaving feel meaningful instead of neutral. It raises the stakes. At this point, they may start to feel exposed in ways they can't explain. You're not interrogating them or pushing them to open up, but your presence invites honesty. You create a space where silence feels louder, where emotional avoidance becomes more obvious. And that awareness is uncomfortable. They start noticing their own patterns reflected back at them. The way they shut down, the way they deflect, the way they retreat when things start to feel real. You don't call them out, but they feel seen anyway. And being seen is not always comforting to someone who learned to survive by staying hidden. The internal dialogue becomes relentless. One part of them wants to stay exactly where they are, wrapped in the safety you offer. Another part is warning them that this closeness will eventually require something they don't know how to give: emotional availability, consistency, presence without escape. They imagine a future and immediately feel overwhelmed by it, not because they don't care, but because caring threatens the emotional independence they've built their identity around. They've always believed that needing someone is dangerous, and with you, they start to feel the edges of need. This is where the push-pull becomes more pronounced. One day they're warm, engaged, present. The next, they're distant, distracted, unreachable. To you, it feels confusing and destabilizing. To them, it feels like self-regulation. Distance becomes their way of calming the emotional intensity that closeness brings. They don't consciously decide to hurt you. They're trying to quiet their own nervous system. Unfortunately, that relief comes at the cost of connection. And the more they pull away, the more you feel the shift, even if you can't fully name it. They might start questioning the connection out loud now, saying things like they're unsure, overwhelmed, or not ready. These statements often sound logical, but underneath them is fear. Fear of being depended on, fear of being emotionally responsible, fear of losing themselves inside a bond. They may even convince themselves that something is wrong because walking away feels easier when there's a reason attached. But the truth is, the problem isn't incompatibility, it's intimacy. It's the depth that comes naturally with you. It's the way you make emotional avoidance impossible to ignore. What hurts the most is that during this phase, they still feel lucky. They still recognize what you bring into their life. They still feel the warmth when they think about you. But luck starts to feel undeserved. They don't believe they can maintain what you offer. And instead of rising to meet it, they shrink back to what feels manageable. They begin preparing themselves for distance before distance even happens, emotionally detaching in small increments so the eventual loss won't feel as sharp, or so they think. You might sense them slipping away before they fully do. The emotional intimacy that once flowed easily now feels strained. You might try to understand, to adjust, to give space without disappearing. And that balance you strike only reinforces how rare you are. You don't chase them into closeness, but you don't punish them with coldness either. You remain steady, and that steadiness, again, is what they don't know how to stay with. Because steadiness requires showing up consistently, not just when it feels safe. Inside them, there is grief already forming. And not because the connection is over yet, but because they feel themselves moving toward an ending. They don't know how to stop. They know that people like you don't come around often. They know that walking away will cost them something real. But the fear of staying feels louder than the pain of leaving. So they start creating emotional distance under the guise of logic, timing, or self-protection. They tell themselves they're being realistic. What they're really doing is choosing familiarity over healing. And when the space grows wider, they feel it. The absence of your presence doesn't bring peace. The way they expected, it brings a dull ache, a quiet sense of loss. Because even though closeness scared them, it also made them feel alive in ways they hadn't felt in years. You didn't just offer connection, you offered possibility. And now that possibility feels like something slipping through their fingers. They may not chase it, they may not fight for it, but they feel it deeply. And that feeling stays with them longer than they ever expected. By the time the distance becomes undeniable, they've already made the decision internally, even if they haven't voiced it yet. This is the stage where pulling away feels less like a reaction and more like a strategy. They start protecting themselves from the depth they feel with you by convincing themselves that staying would cost too much. Not because you demand too much, but because you awaken too much. Your emotional presence makes it harder for them to hide from their own needs, and that exposure feels unbearable. Leaving begins to feel like the only way to regain control over their inner world. They might frame the separation as something rational, even necessary. They may say they need space, clarity, or time. They might claim they're not in the right place for a connection like this. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable, but underneath those words is a deeper truth they can't articulate. Staying with you would require emotional growth they don't yet feel capable of. It would mean learning how to sit with vulnerability instead of escaping it. It would mean letting go of the identity they've built around emotional self sufficiency, and that feels like too much too fast. What they don't say is that leaving hurts, even as they create distance, even as they justify it to themselves. There is a quiet grief that settles in. They don't leave because they don't care. They leave because caring feels dangerous. And walking away becomes an act of self preservation, not indifference. They choose the familiar ache of loss over the unfamiliar challenge of intimacy. At least with loss, they know how to function. At least with distance, they know who they are. You may notice how sudden it feels from your side. One moment, there's connection, depth, shared energy. The next, there's silence, detachment, or emotional coldness. It feels abrupt because the decision wasn't made in the open. It was made internally, quietly, over time. Each moment of closeness added to the weight they were already carrying. And when the weight became too heavy, they dropped the connection instead of learning how to hold it differently. Not because you weren't worth it, but because they didn't believe they were. After the separation, they try to stabilize themselves by minimizing what happened. They tell themselves it wasn't that deep, that it was for the best, that they'll feel relief once enough time passes. And for a short while, they might distance soothes their nervous system. The pressure eases, the emotional intensity fades, and they mistake that numbness for peace. But numbness is not healing, it's just the absence of feeling. And the absence of feeling doesn't erase what you meant to them. As time passes, something unexpected happens. The space they created begins to fill with memories, not the overwhelming ones, but the quiet moments. The way you made things feel simple, the way your presence calmed them without trying, the way you offered understanding without conditions. These memories surface when they least expect them, in stillness, in moments of rest, in situations where they realize how rare that kind of connection actually was. And that's when the feeling of luck returns, sharper than before. And they start comparing new interactions to what they had with you, even if they don't consciously tend to. Others may feel exciting, distant, or intense, but not grounding, not safe, not real in the same way. And this comparison isn't fair to anyone involved, but it happens anyway, because you didn't just occupy a role in their life, you set a standard, a reference point, a quiet benchmark for what emotional safety can feel like. And once someone experiences that, it's hard to forget. What they didn't expect is the regret. Not always loud, not always dramatic, but persistent. A soft ache that comes with a realization that they walked away from something rare. They may not reach out. They may not admit it to anyone, but they feel it. The awareness that they were lucky to have crossed paths with you and that luck doesn't repeat easily. They begin to understand that what scared them wasn't the connection itself, but the version of themselves they would have had to become to keep it. You, meanwhile, are left carrying your own process. The confusion, the self doubt, the wondering if you were too much or not enough. You replay the ending, searching for clarity that was never offered. And that lack of closure can be painful. But the truth, even if it's not comforting at first, is this. You didn't lose them because you failed. You didn't lose them because you loved wrong. You lost them because you arrived with emotional depth they weren't ready to meet. They may never fully articulate this, even to themselves, but on some level, they know. They know you weren't a mistake in their life. You were a moment of possibility, a glimpse of something healthier, deeper, more real than what they've known before. And instead of stepping into that possibility, they stepped away from it, not out of malice, but out of fear. And fear, when left unhealed, always chooses distance. This is the paradox that stays with them. They feel lucky to have met you and burdened by the fact that they couldn't stay. They carry both truths at once: gratitude and regret, relief and loss, and that internal conflict doesn't resolve easily. It lingers, it shapes future connections. It becomes a quiet reminder of what happens when healing is postponed. And even if they move on outwardly, a part of them remains tethered to what they couldn't hold. Long after the connection has ended, you continue to exist in their inner world in ways they never expected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. You become a reference point they didn't intend to create. When life quiets down, when distractions fade, when they're alone with their thoughts, the memory of how it felt to be with you resurfaces. Not the tension, not the fear, the safety, the ease, the rare sense of being understood without explanation. That memory doesn't fade the way others do, because it wasn't built on intensity or fantasy. It was built on something real, and real leaves an imprint. They may try to move on quickly, filling the space with busyness, new connections, or emotional distractions. On the surface, it can look like they're unaffected, but internally, there's a subtle comparison happening. Conversations that don't reach the same depth, presence that feels inconsistent, emotional availability that feels conditional, and even if they can't name it, something feels missing. That something is the way you made connection feel safe instead of performative, the way you didn't require them to be someone else to be accepted, the way your energy allowed them to exhale. Once someone experiences that, it's not easily replaced. You become the relationship they think about when they're honest with themselves, the one that didn't explode or collapse, but quietly slipped away. And that quiet ending is what haunts them the most. There was no dramatic failure to blame, no clear villain, just a choice they made out of fear. And that makes it harder to justify, because deep down they know the loss wasn't inevitable, it was avoidable. And that awareness carries weight. They may never come back, not because they don't want to, but because returning would require facing what they ran from. It would require acknowledging that the reason it didn't work wasn't incompatibility, but unhealed patterns. And that kind of honesty is confronting. It asks them to take responsibility for their emotional limitations. So instead, they carry the lesson quietly. You become the example their mind returns to when they wonder what a healthier connection could feel like, the almost, the what if, the missed opportunity they don't fully process until much later. For you, the imprint looks different. At first, it feels like confusion, a slow unraveling of questions that never got answered. You may wonder how something that felt so aligned could end without a clear explanation. You may question your intuition, your timing, your emotional openness. You may even try to shrink yourself in future connections, fearing that your depth is too much. But over time, something shifts. You begin to see the truth more clearly. You weren't too intense. You weren't too available. You weren't too real. You simply arrived with a level of emotional presence that required readiness on both sides. And readiness is not something you can create for someone else. No amount of patience, understanding, or love can heal avoidance for another person. That work is internal. And the fact that you inspired both longing and fear in them is not a flaw in you. It's evidence of your impact. People don't fear what is meaningless. They fear what has the power to change them. They fear what asks them to grow, and you did that simply by being yourself. Over time, you start to reclaim your sense of self. You remember that your capacity for connection is a strength, not a liability, that your emotional depth is not something to tone down, but something to protect and share with those who can need it. You realize that the pain wasn't caused by loving too much, but by loving someone who couldn't stay present with what that love awakened in them. And that distinction matters because it shifts the story from self-blame to self-respect. They felt lucky to have you, even if they couldn't hold on to you. That truth exists alongside the reality that they couldn't stay. Both can be true at the same time, and neither diminishes your worth. If anything, it confirms it. You were not a lesson in what to avoid. You were a lesson in what is possible when emotional safety meets emotional availability. And even if they couldn't rise to that moment, the experience doesn't disappear. It becomes part of their emotional history, a quiet marker of what real connection feels like. Eventually, the story settles, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You understand that some people come into your life not to stay, but to reflect something back to you, to show you the level of connection you're capable of creating, to remind you that your presence can feel like home to someone who has never known it. And that realization becomes empowering because it means the connection wasn't wasted, it was informative. It taught you what alignment feels like and what misalignment costs. They move forward carrying the memory of you as someone who felt different, someone who didn't demand or drain, someone who offered consistency in a world that taught them to expect chaos or distance. And whether they ever fully heal or not, that memory remains. It influences their choices. It shapes their awareness. It quietly challenges their patterns. You become part of the reason they can no longer pretend that emotional depth doesn't matter. And you move forward knowing something just as important, that you are not hard to love, that your emotional presence is not a burden, that when someone feels lucky to have you but can't stay, it's not because you weren't enough. It's because you were more than they knew how to hold. And the right connection won't feel like luck alone. It will feel like alignment, like mutual readiness, like two people choosing depth instead of running from it. This is where the story ends, not with reconciliation, not with regret, but with truth. They felt lucky to have you, and you deserved someone who could stay.